Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you for joining me this week as we discuss Job. I do want to jump into some current events this time. I have had kind of a light touch recently, and of course, there's so much going on that it always is going to be a light touch. But I do want to touch on a few stories that caught my attention in the news. Maybe you've heard some of these. There's been an issue between the Federal Department of Education and Minnesota because of the development of a kind of paper doll that is called My Gender Dolls. And as I said, these are paper dolls designed for children to use and play with that have interchangeable internal and external genitalia. And this was part of a research project that came out of a department at the University of Minnesota. So the Department of Education was investigating with the suspicion that taxpayer dollars were used to develop these dolls. And clearly they are designed, and they state this in the descriptions, that they are designed for children 4 years old and older. So there are a lot of people in the country, including me, who would not want to have taxpayer dollars go to that kind of a project. Now, the other suspicion was that they were going to use them in elementary, pre-K, and then from kindergarten on as part of curriculum or one of the resources to use when talking about sexuality to kids. Now, the claim from Minnesota is that no taxpayer dollars were used, and I don't know what the truth of that is, so that's in contention right now. But the state of Minnesota says that no taxpayer dollars were used. Also, they say that the intention was never for these dolls to be used in school, but only that they were designed for trained therapists to use with children, which is still horrible when you think about 4-year-old kids and older being given these dolls and told something that is patently untrue. At this point, it is clear. I mean, it's always been clear, forgive me, but at least more people are coming out and saying this now, that a man can never become a woman and a woman can never become a man. And that whatever extremes are employed, including the mutilation of bodies to try to create male genitalia for a female or female genitalia for a male, they never function as the real deal, and they never will. So it's tragic that we still have deeply embedded efforts that are being made to promote this deception that is not a harmless deception. It can cause extreme harm. More and more what they call detransitioners are coming out. Chloe Cole, who is a well-known detransitioner now, testified in Congress a while back, but more and more are coming forward and saying that this has never worked, that they've had continual problems, they've paid serious costs in their personal lives and health, that they become kind of a chronic or perpetual patient for the medical institution because, again, these surgical efforts, mutilations really are never easy or successful, and they cause constant trouble. So, I mean, it's really tragic that we see this deeply embedded movement. I've talked about this before, that even though under the current administration, there have been very bold voices that have felt free now to say publicly and privately that we shouldn't be transitioning children. Hormone therapy, causes all kinds of long-term problems. Certainly, mutilation is terrible, and that children really don't have the wherewithal to make these decisions or to even allow anybody else to make those decisions for them when the costs are so high and so prolonged. Um, However, as I've mentioned, I don't think this ideology has gone away. I think it has just doubled down in certain circles, and it may not be as vocal or as aggressive right now, but it's just kind of percolating under the surface, not very far under the surface, frankly. And I think it's just going to rise up as soon as it can to again try to do damage. Honestly, this is really satanic to take what God has created and act like it's in error, like there are truly women stuck in men's bodies and vice versa. That's not true. And I know people sometimes point to the intersex hermaphrodites, that have some characteristics of each sex physically at birth, but that is clearly understood to be a birth defect. It's very rare, and everybody knows it's a defect. It is something that is abnormal in the development of that child before birth. Anyway, it's tragic to me. And again, we're seeing a resurgence in a lot of places of the idea or the campaign to allow men in women's sports. And it's interesting that continues. I mean, there was something with Sophie Cunningham, who is a teammate to Caitlin Clark in the WNBA. She came out and mentioned being women's sports, and of course she got a lot of pushback there. There is more support for that publicly than there used to be again, but it's still lying in wait and not very under the surface, as I said. We have that San Jose volleyball team for women that other schools have actually decided not to play, not to compete against that team because they have a transgender on there, a male who's on a women's team, and they're concerned about their safety. Anyway, there are all kinds of places where this is still fomenting. And I do think it's one of those things that we're going to see more division on. And the good news is that some people are becoming more confident about defending truth. And that is always good. As we've said, hard times can make strong men and women. And I think this is definitely one of those issues. I hope that you'll talk to your children about this and hear what they're hearing, hear what their friends are hearing. I try to kind of understand what they're exposed to in terms of these ideas and have discussions with them. And please remember that you don't have to have every answer ready to hand. You may be surprised how many things you do have ready to respond with, but this isn't about trying to win an argument. This is about starting a conversation or continuing a conversation that can just open up this subject between parents and children in a safe way where we're not trying to score points, but we're trying to understand what our kids are being exposed to and, validate their concerns and then share some of our own concerns in appropriately incremental ways so that we don't come off like we're, like a fire hose being unleashed on the ideas that we're worried about. It's about cultivating a conversation and a relationship that is safe enough that they can confide in us and we can share with them, as I said, in appropriate increments. It's just an ongoing issue, and it is kind of startling and discouraging when they do like these college campus sort of man on the street, except on a college campus interviews where a lot of our university students believe this nonsense. They have heard it said with such like determined conclusory type of statements, like it's settled, they think. And they'll say that it's settled science. And you're like, yeah, it was about 5 minutes ago. I mean, like it used to be in the DSM as a disorder. And of course, political pressure takes those things out of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So that is a political document, by the way. So it's subject to current trends in therapy. And that's what happens with some of this stuff. Now they say like, oh, it's not a disorder. You're like, yeah, well, it was just a heartbeat ago. Of course, you probably have heard this too. Anthony Fauci has been in the news. I don't know how they got hold of his diary, but apparently they did. And it must not have been a totally illegal fashion because they released parts of the diary publicly, which frankly are really sad. I mean, yes, they're disappointing that someone who had that much power in the federal government during the pandemic should have expressed all the things they put in that diary. But the selections that I heard mostly were about his celebrating how popular he had become in social media and amongst celebrities and news people and so on. It really sounded like the writings of a very insecure person who is, finally getting his 15 minutes of fame and is just so excited about it. And he talks about people he met and we're going to be friends. And, they say I'm the most popular guy in America. And anyway, and I don't ever approve of somebody taking documents like that and ridiculing them. And some people are doing that. And that's always just cruel and unkind. But it doesn't mean that we can't better understand this person that had and wielded so much power during the COVID-19 episode and did influence and, in fact, sort of mandate some decisions, which in retrospect are much more clearly seen. And some of us saw it during that time. I'm sure some of you did too. Things that were ridiculous, like mandating vaccines, especially in the military. And they started out with dishonorable discharges for anyone who wouldn't get the vaccine in the military. I've spoken to some of those people who fought back and said, like, it's completely inappropriate to give me a dishonorable discharge after years of service and all these commendations and medals and so on, and now you're going to kick me to the curb. In fact, one was a helicopter pilot that was a friend of one of our sons and daughters-in-laws, and I spoke with him at length in their home one time at a gathering, and he said they had come back to him and begged him to re-enlist or to come on again as an officer, which he was, because they had lost so much ability and talent and experience. Some of their finest fighting men and women were dismissed. So it's interesting now to see that the man who mandated so much of that, and of course the school closures, which had done so much damage to a whole generation or more. But at any rate, lots of things were looking back. It reminded me of Elder David Bednar, who spoke, and I've quoted this before, but at a J. Reuben Clark Law School, which is the law school at BYU, symposium or something that they did during the pandemic, and so it was all Zoom. But he made this statement, which again is both a comment on what was happening, but also a definite admonition for times to come. There are many things he said, but this was one that I really liked when he said, "Never again must the fundamental right to worship God be trivialized below the ability to buy gasoline." Now remember, churches closed, and it was forbidden for congregations to gather to worship. Some people were even shut down that were like doing it in their cars with loudspeakers and so on. So there was a real push against that. There were some very brave priests and ministers who continued to meet with congregations. Some of them were arrested. I don't even know what the outcome has been legally for them. I hope that's all over in a positive way. But yeah, churches were closed. And I remember Chris and I talking about this right when it was happening. Like, so abortion clinics can be open, liquor stores can be open, but not churches. These are essential services, abortions and liquor stores. But people couldn't go in and get cancer screenings. And how many older people passed away without their families with them because of restrictions for visiting nursing homes? How many fathers or support people were not able to be there at the birth of their child? There were just so many things that were going on that really were authoritarian, were out of control. And so it reminds us that, like, the people who have these positions are not necessarily wise. Credentials of the world don't mean they're wise. And I'm not one that says, like, forget the science, because, like, there's a lot to be learned from honest research, but it can go too far in a heartbeat. And as the Book of Mormon clearly warns, when they are learned, they think they are wise. I mean, we need better accountability. We need not to accept authoritarian policies. The church didn't ask us to protest or resist, so I'm all for following church leaders. But it was a brutal time, and it's kind of interesting to see that. He went to Congress and was asked to submit to some questions, and pled the fifth 111 times. Nice number there, right? 111. Pled the Fifth Amendment, which protects you against self-incrimination. However, legally, because he received a presidential pardon, which was, really of broad scope, ridiculous, frankly, but because he received that pardon, it sort of takes away his right to use the Fifth Amendment. So there's some legal wrangling about that. Not that it'll really produce anything because nobody seems accountable, including, I just have to mention this again. I know I've mentioned it before, but Congress is certainly not accountable. And people are voting for them. So what can you say? But this SAVE Act that President Trump is pushing, which is actually very popular across parties. Now, there are two basic provisions to the SAVE Act. One of them is showing ID when you go to vote, which makes a lot of sense. Some states already require that, and nobody has seemingly lost their franchise in those states. But in California, for instance, it's against the law for a poll worker to ask for ID. So they really don't want to know who's voting. And you look at how long it takes them to count their ballots. And anyway, it's just rife for disaster. But across the board, we're talking Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, 77% of the citizens of the United States believe, the voting age citizens believe, that there should be voter identification. 77%. I mean, when was the last time our country had a 77% approval of almost anything? So this is one of those, what they call 80-20 issues, where it's almost 80% for and 20% against. Now, the other part of the SAVE Act, however, is not quite as popular, but still gets majority support. And that is that in order to register to vote, you need to show that you are a citizen. So that would require a passport or a birth certificate, something equivalent to that. And 59% across parties are in favor of that. Almost 60% believe that someone should demonstrate that they're a citizen, that they should be able to prove that before they go on the voter rolls. Now, Congress can't pass it. Well, the House has passed it a couple of different times, I think, but the Senate won't even take it up, which is majority Republican right now. And even if we lost a couple of votes, the vice president would be able to give a tiebreaker vote in favor. But they won't even bring it up to a vote. So you think, again, like, where's the accountability? And yet these people keep getting elected. Of course, they're electing Democratic Socialists out there in the primaries, so who knows what's coming. But it is discouraging, and it does seem to me to be the rise of Getty and robbers, and sadly, kind of to some extent, uneducated or unwilling to educate themselves, or apathetic populace. Not everybody. There are some really good players that are out there trying to, without venom, without nastiness, are trying to provide more conversation. And I am grateful for that. I really am, that there are a lot of people, strong men and women, who are coming to the forefront and advocating for truth, for a civil society, for protection for citizens, and so on. Now, another story I needed to mention. So, again, I'm taking some time to catch up on some of these stories this week. And you may have heard about this too, because the videos are pretty amazing and disastrous. Spain, that, comes right down to the Mediterranean, the southwest corner of Spain comes right down to the Mediterranean. And then there's the Rock of Gibraltar, and it's not a long distance in the Mediterranean Sea that kind of goes through that pass. And then there's Morocco. And at the tip of Morocco, there's a Spanish enclave that is under Spanish governance. So it is the territory of Spain, but it's in the very tip of Africa. When I was there with BYU and a 6-month abroad program in my undergrad years, we made that little trip on a ferry from that southwestern tip of Spain to northern Africa, and we spent some time in Morocco, but the little enclave is called Ceuta. or if you use the theta of the Castellano, it's Ceuta. But Ceuta is the name of this little Spanish territory at the tip of Africa, with the Rock of Gibraltar really nearby. Chris and I, actually, when we visited Spain many years ago, and southern Spain especially, although we did spend time in Madrid, and Spain is a beautiful country, so this is all heartbreaking. They're really struggling right now. But we stayed in a resort. It was a Marriott resort right on the coast, and could see the Rock of Gibraltar. When the sky was clear, we could see the Rock of Gibraltar right from our unit. And anyway, good memories. But Spain has a very leftist president right now, Pedro Sanchez, offered amnesty to illegal immigrants that had been in Spain. There were a few parameters. They had to have been there for a certain number of years. They had to, be working or whatever. I forget all the parameters. But they said they figured they had about 500,000 illegal immigrants in Spain. And so they decided to give them amnesty. They had to apply for it. Well, something close to 1.7 million applied. So over 3 times what they had estimated were living in Spain applied for amnesty. And I don't know exactly what the details are in terms of how many were granted amnesty, but that was the direction they were going. And they had made that very public, and it opened up applications for amnesty. Well, that was like waving a red flag in front of a bull, because all these Northern African men came to Ceuta. They just stormed it. Like, the videos just show them, coming on boats and leaping off the boats, walking ashore and going over walls and just going right past any kind of border maintenance or facility or infrastructure and just crowding through. Now, this was the very first day that it happened. It has been continuing. So I don't know what the most recent numbers are, but a couple of days ago when this happened, saw the videos, saw the information that the Spanish population of citizens in Ceuta is about 84,000. And on the first day, over 60,000 African men came in. These were men, they figured vast majority were between the ages of 18 and 34. So basically, they often refer to them as military-aged men who are Muslim. They're not economic refugees. That is clear. And they're not doing any vetting. So we don't know if they've committed crimes or been involved with terrorism. Like, there's no filtering at all. And many people have said, like, this was basically happening. I mean, if you think back to the days of Bill Melugin on the southern border of the United States, reporting when the border was open under the Biden administration, there were some very similar scenes. It looks a little more frenetic in the Ceuta videos, but it was similar to what was happening on the southern border. So a lot of the U.S. commentators are saying, this is our future if we get more socialists involved in the government, because they are very openly saying they want open borders. And not just the socialists, but also some of the leftists as well that are in the government and trying to be in governmental positions don't want a border. And again, when you go on these college campuses, you ask these young people, a lot of them saying that there just shouldn't be borders. That's not right. America has done a lot of bad things, and everybody deserves a piece of the pie. So anyway, I'm keeping my eye on southern Spain there. Well, northern Africa, Ceuta, but they now, will certainly be able to go into Spain and the mainland and the rest of Europe as long as the EU has those easy border crossings. So it's just kind of fascinating that here we are. This is a really good example of suicidal empathy. We need to be generous. Other people in the world aren't as blessed as we are. So let's put everybody in the lifeboat and then be surprised if the lifeboat sinks. Well, somebody wrote in a question and asked what the difference was between communism or socialism and the United Order. And that's an excellent question. I've talked about this before, but it's probably been quite a while since I discussed this. And I'm going to make this really brief, but I would really encourage people to do Google or, AI chat and find more, because you could Google or chat LDS prophets' statements on communism. David O. McKay made a ton of comments about the dangers of communism. Now, think about when he was prophet. It was when the USSR came into superpower status after World War II. And there were many members of the church who thought it might be a good thing because it was like the United Order or, the law of consecration. And so they were promoting it. And David O. McKay made really strong statements saying that, no, this was Satan's counterfeit and it was evil, it was satanic, and all of that kind of warning language. I've quoted some of that in the past. I'm not going to do that today, but it's easy to find. But here are the basic differences, and they are enormous. Even just two that I'm going to make a big point of are enormous differences, night and day differences. The first is the preservation of agency. Socialism takes away agency. It is compelled. If you have socialist leaders, you don't have a choice as to whether or not you participate in the collective. And the state takes over private property and takes over the centers of production, the means of production. So everything is state-owned. You're a renter wherever you live, whether or not you currently are a homeowner or wanted to be. Private property goes away. It's all state-owned. There is no personal choice. You don't get a choice to participate or not participate. You're in. If you have a socialist government, you are in the system and you don't get to leave. In fact, notice that in all socialist or communist countries, they make it very difficult for you to leave. Why? Because more people would leave. It's such an unproductive and destructive system. People would leave, but they are prevented from doing so because choice is taken away. Of course, taking away or seeking to take away the cardinal gift of God to his children, agency, the chance to choose. And of course, we always have agency to choose God or not, whatever our circumstances. But freedom allows for a broader use of agency. And freedom is what is lost under socialism and communism. Choice is taken away. It is not by choice that you enter the system. You are conscripted if you're underneath the dominion of that government. And that makes an enormous difference. I remember when I was growing up, we would talk about some of these things in school. Back then, schools taught that communism was bad. Anyway, I remember hearing stories that were, real life stories of families where the father, who was told, okay, well, you're good at engineering, so you have to be an engineer, and you're going to have to work in this city. But your wife, who, is teaching elementary school or high school or whatever, we want her over here. So they would have to live in separate places, even though they were married and wanted to live together. But no, they weren't allowed to because the state wanted this one here and the state wanted that one there. So, those were really happening. Those situations happened a lot under communism. Really, it's amazing that our young people and a lot of our adults don't know how bad communism is. But choice is taken away. Freedom, to a large extent, is taken away. I talked last week about how the costs go up and the quality goes down. And I mentioned in the end of that segment last week, public education, which is a great example of that outcome. The costs have increased dramatically in education, not just, of course, the universities, which have become astronomically expensive, but also just our public education. It absorbs more and more tax dollars all the time. And yet our outcomes are getting worse and worse. We look worse and worse in global comparisons when we look at like the math competency of our children or how good they are at science or writing or reading or comprehension. It's dramatic that we have now kind of socialized public education over the last many, many years, decades, and the quality goes down and the costs go up. So this is always what happens under socialism and or communism, which is really just all in the same spectrum of evil. The second big difference, so agency, the loss of freedom, is number one. Number two, private ownership. The United Order, as again, voluntarily entered into Only those who choose to participate are a part of the system, part of the order. Those who enter deed their property to the bishop. That is a consecration of all your material goods. And you give that to the bishop who is in charge. And then the bishop, consulting with everybody, deeds back a stewardship. So let's say you're a baker. He deeds back to the family, or the one who's taking the stewardship, the bakery and all the materials like machinery and so on that is necessary for running that bakery. And it is given by deed to each steward. Somebody is a music teacher, what do you need for that? Okay, we are deeding that to you. You own it. This is your business. Your farm, if that's what you're doing, you're running cattle over here. Okay, you have given all your stuff to the bishop under the law of consecration, and now consulting, like, what do you want to do? Where do you want to use your talents? Where do you want to magnify? It's deeded back to you. You own it. It's private property. Again, we just talked about private property is abolished under socialism. And you have people in Mamdani's New York administration who are saying that they want people to start rethinking private ownership and private property. Like I said, they're not even bashful about this anymore. So they take away private ownership. United Order, it's all about private ownership. Your stewardship is deeded to you. And then you get to make the choices about it. The state doesn't come and tell you whether you can or can't expand, or if you want to change from running, sheep to goats, or, whatever. Like, they're not going to tell you how to do it or what crops you have to plant or what you have to teach. It's your stewardship, and you get to be thoughtful and prayerful and apply your skills and talents and desires to grow your business or grow your stewardship. And then at the end of the year, there's basically it's like tithing settlement, except it's a stewardship settlement. And you come in and talk to the bishop and talk about, like, here was my prosperity report for the year, or I lost money, or I lost, some of the business, but here I gained, or somebody else gained. And then there's sort of a redistribution to the extent necessary so that the poor who have not been able to support themselves are given out of the excess. Now, can we guarantee that there's going to be excess? Yes, we can, because the Lord always prospers his people. Look what happened. Again, we see it in the Book of Mormon very clearly, but in other scriptures as well, that when people are obedient, they prosper. The Lord is the God of the harvest, so he can send what his people need. So as the order continues, yes, some might struggle one year, but generally speaking, the group will progress and prosper, and the poor can be taken care of and start again. If they have diminished their stewardship, they could have another shot, while those who are succeeding can continue to grow and say, like, okay, well, I did really well with this. I'd like to grow to this. I love that in the D&C, when it talks so much about the law of consecration, it always talks about people being granted what they need according to their needs and wants. And I remember when I first was reading the D&C back in high school, that gave me pause, because I thought, how could that happen? How could people get what they want? Now, obviously, if we are, into that Zion people business, we're not going to covet our own property, and we're not trying to show up the neighbors. So it won't be about greed or about display of wealth, but it will be about magnifying our talents and being able to contribute in greater and greater measure to Zion and expand our own talents and abilities and inventions. I mean, the light of Christ flows in Zion. So there is this upward spiral of growth and development and prosperity. So dramatic differences between communism and socialism, which is, again, just a satanic counterfeit. And Satan always says that. Now, I have a whole section in the book Choosing Glory, must be a whole chapter, I don't remember which one, that talks about Satan's counterfeits. And in that book, I'm talking about what telestial law looks like, terrestrial law, celestial law, and I talk about how that applies to mate selection, marriage, parenting, dealing with stress, and progression. But when I'm presenting the whole beginning of that structure model that is a gospel model, I do take time to talk about how Satan always tries to counterfeit the celestial. And what he tends to do is preserve the form, but the content goes from righteous to evil. So the law of consecration is based on agency, individual ownership, and stewardship, and the ability to magnify and receive not only our needs, but our wants, and also as opposed to Satan's miserable counterfeit, which is through compulsion, which is always Satan's way, right? Take away their choice. I'm going to compel them. And where there's no growth, no innovation, no motivation to do anything better because you don't have any control over your own stewardship or life anyway. It's all state-owned. And yes, as I said, instead of private ownership, it's state ownership. Granted, at a very quick look, it could look like, well, those are very similar. But no, the content is diametrically different. What I also talk about in the book is that terrestrial forms of government or economies or whatever, even in individual life, living at a terrestrial level is a safety net from falling into the telestial, but it often looks different from the celestial because it's a fallback measure. It's a fail-safe. So what is the terrestrial economy? The free market. That's not the law of consecration. And it does allow for predatory capitalism. It does. I mean, there are people who abuse the system and, prey on others and so on, and that's unfortunate. So it's not a perfect system, but it's a fail-safe against communism. So anyway, if you want to know more about that, check out my book, Choosing Glory. It's still available. Okay. That's a lot of news. I do want to just mention one great quote that I was reminded of this past week. This is a Thomas Sowell quote. I've told you before, I'm a big Thomas Sowell fan. He's a 96-year-old at this point, Black economist, did 3 degrees in economics, bachelor's, master's, and PhD, first at Harvard, then Columbia, then University of Chicago. And then he went to work for the Department of Labor, I believe, in Washington because he was a Marxist. And he wanted to, help the poor, the oppressed, because he kind of bought into that model. And then the data talked him out of that belief, and he became conservative. And he has been a very outspoken advocate for conservatism and for not getting caught in a class war or, he's written like over 40 books. Really a brilliant man with this sort of chuckle in his voice. I love listening to him. He's at the Hoover Institution right now. It's on Stanford University campus, but it's a conservative think tank. Really a brilliant, brilliant man. They say that Clarence Thomas has said in a way that he has been highly influenced by Thomas Sowell. Another brilliant, both brilliant men. So this is the quote that I was reminded of, that when Thomas Sowell was talking about Barack Obama, he said, he is often wrong, but never in doubt. Often wrong, but never in doubt. And I really appreciated the reminder because we see that all over. We see people talk about things like they know, and they're not doing critical thinking. And what I wanted to mention about Thomas Sowell again was that his journey is a beautiful kind of a poster boy experience for critical thinking, because he was interested in and kind of captured by the Marxist ideology. But then when he started doing research and seeing what the stats actually show, he changed his perspective completely. He was willing to be moved by the data. And too often people aren't. It's like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I've mentioned my dad had these cards on his office bulletin board in Indiana. And one of them said, "My mind is made up. Don't confuse me with facts." And we see that on every side, which is really kind of a shutting down of the light of Christ for sure. People who just don't want to ever be wrong about anything. They don't want to be open enough to say like, well, that's a good thought. Let me at least consider it. Let me do a little more research. Instead, it's just like, no, I heard this on a TikTok video or, I heard this on a news show, whatever. And I'm a diehard, like you just don't bother me with data. Are you kidding? And Thomas Sowell is exactly the opposite. He's an example of looking at the data and saying, oh, look, this is what's going on. It's not what I thought. And anyway, brilliant, brilliant man. Check him out. All kinds of YouTube videos of his talking, and everyone is brilliant. One of my kids did mention to me, because I had advocated them listening to Thomas Sowell, and they said, gosh, he makes me feel kind of dumb. I'm like, but embrace the stretch. Embrace the stretch. Slow it down. Do it in small bits. But wow. And they did. And they have appreciated him as well. Okay, so I'm going to save this one for next time. Oh, I have to throw this one in. There's a wonderful story. Boy, I'm taking a long time on current events. This was just one of those delightful stories. Harrowing at first, but the happy ending of a rescue of a 10-year-old boy who was swimming off Santa Cruz. And the surf just really got stronger, and there was a riptide. That current that's pulling you back out to sea. And these waves were like 8 to 10 foot waves, they report. In the video, they look like they could be higher, but right coming up to the beach. So they're really pounding on the beach at that height. So it's not some gentle, slow, coming onto the water, onto the beach. It's like pounding, huge waves. Well, this 10-year-old boy gets stuck out in the riptide, and he is rescued by a 16-year-old lifeguard. What a great kid. I mean, this just makes you know there are some really wonderful young men out there who are going to grow into fabulous, fabulous men. He courageously goes out, gets that kid, and somebody captured most of it. Of course, they didn't get the very first part, but they capture most of it as the lifeguards bring the boy back to shore, and they are pounded by waves, and they disappear. I mean, there was a huge waves. In fact, the lifeguard, and you know this if you've been out body surfing or whatever, but when he sees one of the big waves coming, he takes the boy in his arms and he turns their heads into the wave, which is certainly much safer so that they don't get rolled as much. But anyway, these are huge crashing waves, and some of us know what it's like to get caught in that kind of surf where you do just upend yourself and you don't know which way is up. You don't know which way to go for air sometimes. So it looks like it was that situation, but he really cleverly navigates it under extreme duress. And somehow these waves crash on him, and you think that he would have to let go of the boy. He never lets go. The tide finally goes out or the wave goes away, and he's holding on to that kid. Now, some other Good Samaritan young men come and try to help him, and the waves push them away. Like when the waves come, they have to, they let go. And so it's even more amazing that these other well-intentioned guys that are trying to help, and maybe helped a little bit, but they couldn't maintain their grip. Finally, another lifeguard is coming from another area and helps him in the last little bit to get the boy onto solid ground. But it's such a beautiful, heroic moment. So let's just celebrate these wonderful young people who are really willing to be brave, to have courage, and to help their neighbors. Obviously, it was this kid's job, but, that doesn't really have to mean anything. A lot of people don't do their jobs when it counts. And he does. In fact, the president invited him to come with his family to the White House. I think they were going to bring the boy and the 10-year-old as well with his family to celebrate that kind of heroism. So have to end on a happy note there. Now let's talk about Job, which is, again, it's a beautiful story, but it's painful. Now, immediately this question comes up. Is it fact or fiction? And people really fall on either side of this all the time. As some people straddle the fence and say, I'm not sure, and it doesn't really matter. And I don't think that's a bad place to land, that it really doesn't matter. But I fall on the side of fact, which is not to say that there isn't a lot of literary device in the telling of this story. Now, maybe you noticed an extra lesson that they put in the curriculum this year that talked about the books of poetry in the Bible. And Job is one of them. and Psalms and Ecclesiastes. Some of these are poetry in the Bible. And you can definitely see the literary devices used in the book of Job. But that doesn't mean it's not a true story. And talking with one of my sons about it, I said, there are two reasons that I would say, first of all, that just because something becomes kind of a legend in the storytelling doesn't mean it's not true. And this is even true of like King Arthur in the court of Camelot, right? There actually was a king in England who tried to do kind of the Knights of the Round Table thing, anyway, or he had a round table or whatever. I read about that in my youth because I was really intrigued by that whole story of Camelot. By the way, it's a wonderful Broadway play that they made a movie of with Richard Harris and Vanessa Redgrave. I'm sure it's still available. It's really great music, and it's a sad story, but it also has kind of an inspirational ending. So if you're looking for another great movie to watch, it's a musical, but Camelot. There is another one that I came up with when I was talking to Harper, and it was the Iliad. Because when I was in high school, I remember reading a book by Irving Wallace called The Greek Treasure. And it was sort of a biography of Heinrich Schliemann, who was an archaeologist that wanted to find Troy. Now, the conventional wisdom at that time was that Troy was a myth. I mean, the Iliad is an epic poem, right? And we figured that the blind poet Homer would go from court to court and kind of sing it. But Schliemann said there's enough evidence in there that it sounds like it was a real place. Was there literary license taken? Sure. I mean, Achilles is half a god or whatever it is. The arrow is guided by one of the gods to hit Achilles' heel. Anyway, in the Iliad, those of you who have read that epic poem know that there is a lot of kind of fantasy woven in, but Schliemann was convinced it was true, and he spent tons of time and money looking, and he found the 7 cities of Troy built on top of each other. One gets kind of ruined and the next one goes on top. And he found what was called King Priam's treasure, and it was on display. It disappeared during World War II, go figure. But it was on display in museums all over the world. So just because somebody has turned it into a legend type story doesn't mean there isn't truth to it. And I'm not the only one who believes that, although, like I said, this conversation was had with one of my sons a while ago. And then when I was looking up some content on Job, there was a BYU Religious Studies Center article from one of the Sperry Symposiums by John Tanner called Hast Thou Considered My Servant Job? And he said the same thing. So that was kind of fun for me. He said, for many years, scholars thought the city of Troy to be a fiction and ridiculed Schliemann when he went to dig for Homer's fabled Troy until he found it. And then I love this statement. We need to be skeptical of our own modern skepticism. Boy, I love that statement. We need to be skeptical of our own modern skepticism. And, I've talked to so many people who are encountering this in their ward Sunday school classes or wherever, with families or friends or whatever, who are members of the church, but have become skeptics. And they kind of challenge the veracity of a lot of our Old Testament or other scripture stories. And they sort of water them down, saying that, like, that's just unsophisticated in a way to believe those things. Like it's, again, it's the sort of condescending sophistication of the modern skeptic who's looking at those things. And I'm not saying we can't question stuff, but, you sort of hear this more and more, it seems, in the church, that we think we're too cool to believe some of the scripture record. And I'm sad about that because I'm not saying we won't have some clarification to come. I'm sure we will. But as a default, I figure, like, this is what it says. This is what God wants me to ponder and to know. Now, the other reason I really feel that Job is real, and this is by far the more important part to me, is that in section 121, when Joseph Smith is reaching out in agony to God because of the sufferings that not only he and those imprisoned with him, but also the Latter-day Saints are experiencing. What is part of God's response? He says, remember the first thing about all these things shall give the experience and be for that good. But then he says later, thou art not yet as Job. Honestly, that does it for me, brothers and sisters. I can't believe that God would take a mythical figure and kind of hold that up to Joseph Smith in the midst of serious suffering. That just doesn't work for me. Like, would you say to somebody who is really hurting or going through some really difficult time, well, you're not acting like Achilles, who was, unable to be injured, or you're not handling this like Superman. Like, you should be more like Superman. You should be more like any of the mythical figures. I don't see God ever doing that in our depths of sorrow. He's going to hold up somebody who didn't exist and is just sort of a literary figure. I don't think so. I don't think so. On a personal note, too, Job has been a place I have gone for comfort in my worst moments, and certainly after losing Chris, which was the worst season of my life to this point. I thought a lot about Job. I read Job, parts of Job again, and I was comforted. But a lot of that comfort came because I believe he was a real person. Now, let's talk about the literary devices, though, because they are all over the place. First of all, there is clear poetry. The way it's written is very much in the way that Hebrew poetry was, where two things come one after another and they're saying the same thing in different language. We see that all through Job, but some of the chapters are rife with it. And you can hear the poetry. You can hear that it's carefully worded. I'm trying to find, I know I marked one part as poetry, but I may not find it quickly enough. But it's lovely to look at it that way and see the tenderness and the emotionality of the language as ideas are stated one after another that are the same but different angles. I'll see if I can find it as we're turning through here. I do want to go through some of these chapters, just a few spots, right? Because there was a lot to read this time, and there's much more in the book of Job that was not in our assigned chapters. But again, we see the literary device that Satan is walking around heaven where God is meeting with some of the sons of God, and he challenges God, and God is like, well, have you, consider my servant Job? Like, no, you think God is playing with us like that? That he's having a bet with the adversary over our well-being just to see if we can take it? Again, that's not the God that I worship. I do believe Job is a real man. I believe the basics of this story are accurate and real. But no, the framing of it is definitely kind of a poetic, literary treatment of his story. Again, very much like the Iliad was a fictional account, or Camelot is a fictionalized account of a real being, a real King Arthur. So this happens all the time. I don't know why it bothers us to think that could be the case, but he's basically saying, well, sure, he worships God because he's happy and has all this prosperity. And then God says, okay, well, you can do anything you want, except you can't touch him. And then later they amend that because Satan says, well, you wouldn't let me touch him. If you let me touch him. And so then he's smitten with boils and, his health is taken away. And even his wife invites him to curse God and die. So he is really, really hammered now. I don't believe that whatever happened, that God would say, yeah, take your best shot. I mean, that's absurd. But we get some of these incredible, incredible statements of faith throughout the book of Job. Yes, he does a lot of complaining. And you know what? That gave me comfort too, and has before. But in the last couple of years especially, has given me a lot of comfort that good people do struggle when they're in the valley of the shadow. But look at this at the end of chapter 1, verse 21. Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I have thought about that throughout my life, ever since I became acquainted with Job in the first place. That has been in my mind during hard times. The Lord hath given, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And of course, he says this, and this is the companion idea, of course, in chapter 2, verse 10, when his wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? And he says, thou speakest as one of the foolish women. And here it is. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? Again, are we just fair weather saints? Are we just going to praise him when there's money in the bank, food in our belly, a roof over our head, our kids are happy and healthy, our marriage is good? Like, really? Like, where's the spiritual muscle there? Like, shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord and not receive evil? Now, ultimately, and Job testifies of this in beautiful terms that we've put to music in the Messiah, well, Handel did. I know that my Redeemer liveth. He believes that, yes, this temporal life can involve incredible loss, but that's not the end of the story. And I think that ultimately is the message of Job, that we can suffer in this life when we are not guilty of sin. His friends accuse him of being a sinner because that's their framework. If you do what's right, you don't have trouble. Well, again, how does that fit with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph? Was he a bad guy that all those bad things happened to him? Moses, like Nephi. Go anywhere you want. Abinadi, Moroni. That just doesn't hold water. It still astonishes me when people are kind of stuck in that idea that if you do what's right, you won't have problems. And again, what would be the purpose of earth life if not to be a spiritual weight room where, as we are confronted with challenges that have the potential to refine us and deepen our faith and increase our trust in God and grow our compassion and our patience and our focus on Christ, and what would be the purpose of life if not to provide that spiritual weight room experience? What would we think it's about? This is why we came. This is why there's a veil. This is why there's agency. So we can decide to choose God even in the midst of confusion and conflict and troubles and loss, heartbreak, injustice, betrayal. You've heard me say this before. When my children were growing up and they would deal with unfairness, which everybody does, I would first listen and validate, and after that would say, well, it's not every day we get to prove we're Christian, but this is one of those days. If we can rise above the understandable feelings of abandonment when we get hammered by life and we were just trying to do what was right, that's when we get to truly become, not just prove we're Christian, but to truly become more Christian, more refined, more on the path to being conformed to the image of our Savior Jesus Christ. Now, chapter 3, honestly, this has given me a lot of comfort to read his pain in the past, not just, as I said, recently, but even before. Oh, here's where we see some of that kind of poetry in this language. Let's look at chapter 3, verses 3 and beyond. Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. So he's saying, let there not even be the day or night where I was born or conceived. Let that day be darkness. That's a repeated idea. Let that day be darkness. Let not God regard it from above. Same idea from a different perspective. Neither let the light shine upon it. This is poetry. We're hearing the same idea said in different language that all adds dimension. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it. Same idea. Let a cloud dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. This is an idea he is stating again and again in different poetic language. Verse 6, as for that night, let darkness seize upon it. Let it not be joined unto the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. So can you see how this is very different from what we read in previous books, like First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings? Like they're telling the facts of the case in those places. Job is speaking poetry here, and it's real pain, but he's expressing it, or it is being written in beautiful language. It goes on. I'm not going to read all of this, but if you can watch for that in Job, you'll see the poetry of it, the beauty of the language, the expressiveness of the phrasing and the words chosen. Verse 11, why died I not from the womb? Some people, have characterized Job as suicidal. I wouldn't necessarily argue with that. He doesn't take his life. He doesn't attempt to do that because his respect for God is real and profound. But he hates his life. Many of us have felt that. I've said this many times now, but I feel very loosely attached to life myself. Death seems like a release to me, and it doesn't mean that I don't have blessings or that I don't recognize them and have a wonderful family, and I'm very grateful for them, but I'm tired. I miss Chris in an aching constancy. I would be happy to be done, except I got to get the book done first. And I've had conversations with God about that. Let me just get this book done, and then we'll see. And the book is coming. Energy and focus are limited, but it is so close now. I'm excited that we're getting close to being able to fulfill those pre-sales. I mean, it will have to go through some production after the revisions, but it's close. Okay, his friends really are not good friends in his time of trouble. Corrine contacted me and asked me to talk about how we can comfort people in their times of trouble. And here are things not to do. I will do that. It has taken me a long time to get to this point, and I apologize for the delay, but I have not forgotten it, and I will be doing that on Patreon when we have people near to us that have experienced deep loss. I will talk about some of the pros and cons that hopefully will be helpful for the individuals going through it, but also for those that are around them and care, and bless you for caring for people who are struggling and experiencing all kinds of loss. That one of his friends in chapter 5, now this is not in the reading, but I've had it marked forever, and I'm sure you've heard it, verse 7 of chapter 5, yet man is born into trouble as the sparks fly upward. It's like, yeah, that seems right, because it's a test, because we are here to see if we can overcome the natural man against the current. Verse 17, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore, despise not the chastening of the Almighty. Well, that's typically pretty good advice, except not to Job, and not at this time. Like they're telling Job, well, God must be telling you need to repent. So just accept it and embrace it and repent. Job's not a sinner. Like everybody who suffers isn't a sinner. Now, some people are, because, you can make your own trouble and break the commandments, put your hand on a bunch of hot stoves and get burned. But there's also a group of people who are setting their sights on the celestial kingdom, and that is a path of being refined in the furnace of affliction. So we make these hasty judgments of like, well, Job must have been a sinner. No, he was not. So it's pretty nasty that his friends kind of jumped to that. You'd think they would have known him better, but oh well, they're going with some kind of limited perspective, and they're not great friends. Talk a little bit more about that later. Again, in chapter 6, are really painful words said by Job about why doesn't God just destroy me, and why should I even hope? I mean, these are beautiful words, painful, but I don't know if this is the case for everybody, but I find them to be comforting because I guess it validates the negativity of my own pain. Now, notice at the end of the book, Job repents. And, I sort of debated about why did he repent? What did he have to repent from? Obviously, God tells him it wasn't because he was a sinner. His friends are wrong. But I have said this myself. I feel like I need to repent of my own negativity. It didn't stop me from trusting God. It didn't stop me from trusting His plan. None of this pain has stopped me from absolute faith in God keeping His promises. I am so grateful that I have believed that and never stopped believing it. But it doesn't mean I haven't been pretty negative, and I'm sure I could be more grateful for life. So I recognize that sometimes our expressions of pain, while Christ totally understands how we feel and is the ultimate validator, it doesn't mean it's ideal. I mean, we know that even Christ wished that His cup could pass from Him. So it's not a sin to want to avoid pain, but it is part of the plan. Again, the echo from Adam and Eve there, is there no other way? No, apparently there is no other way in the path to sanctification and ridding ourselves of our earthly troubles and weaknesses and frailties. Okay, I'm going to skip here. Again, chapter 10, my soul is weary of my life, right there at the beginning. Verse 15, toward the end, I am full of confusion. That's just so resonant, isn't it, to many of us in difficult times? But he does give these beautiful testimonies in chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. He also shall be my salvation. Two parts, the beautiful two parts of Job. The two beautiful parts of Job, perhaps, I should say. The pain that is real and honest, and the unyielding faith. You won't take my testimony from me. I will not allow that. But I'm miserable. I think those are so much a blessing for us when we go through our own times to try to find that same unyielding conviction, but not condemn ourselves for our pain. He talks too about the fact that wicked people seem to have a good life a lot of times. And again, that's part of the trials of this world. But people who are not too interested in progress don't necessarily get tried. I mean, we know that some people die rich and famous when they've been real scoundrels, and that's just reality. So Job notes that too. But this is another one that I love here, chapter 16, verse 2. He's talking about his friends here. I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. And it's true. His friends are not comforting him. Okay, what else are we talking about here? I'm going to skip a lot. Of course, chapter 19, verse 25, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. That is the unyielding faith of Job in the midst of his misery. Chapter 21 is one of the places where he talks about how the wicked seem to prosper. I'm skipping a lot of good stuff. But again, his friend's not super nice, and at the end it says that Job repents. I would suggest that he's just repenting of the negativity, but it's a pretty mild repentance. He's not a sinner. He was not before, and he's not since. He was not a part of a bargain with God and Satan either. I am confident about that. Okay, a few thoughts about Job that I really enjoyed, and I just want to kind of wrap up with that. There's some notable literary and philosophical statements about Job. I'm just going to choose a few that I found. Thomas Carlyle, who was a Scottish essayist and historian, I call the book of Job, apart from all the theories about it, one of the greatest things ever written with pen. There is nothing written, I think, in the Bible or out of it of equal literary merit. High praise, high praise. Victor Hugo, that French novelist who wrote Les Miserables. Tomorrow, if all the literature of the world were to be destroyed, and it rested with me to choose one book to save, I would save the book of Job. Wow. Wow. Victor Hugo is well read. If all the literature of the world were to be destroyed and it rested with me to choose one book to save, I would save the book of Job. Harold S. Kushner, who is a rabbi and author, he's the guy who wrote Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. He writes, bad things do happen to good people in this world, but it is not God who wills it. Now, I will say that the plan is God's, and it does allow for wicked people to hurt righteous people and for elements of this fallen planet to impact us. Disease, natural disaster, scarcity, economic troubles, geopolitical troubles. It's part of the plan, but I do agree that God does not, again, make a deal to smite people for some sort of entertainment. That, of course, is not what he's saying here. The book teaches that God cannot do everything, but he can be with us in our pain. Now, again, let me qualify what I think he's saying here, and I'm not sure exactly how he means it, but I mean it this way. God can do anything and everything, but because he wants us to grow, he, in charity, in his perfect love, allows us to go through our times of tribulation so that we can be refined in the furnace of affliction and come forth like gold. He can turn us from lead to gold, that celestial alchemy that can get us from the dust of earth to the throne of God. So if he were to put forth his hand and spare us from all troubles, it would be the opposite of love. It would be the ultimate unkindness. He would prevent us from ever growing toward him, to be like him. And finally, G.K. Chesterton, who was an English writer often quoted, who had some nice statements. The pressure of the artistic punishment here lies in the fact that Job is comforted with riddles. Remember at the end where God says, who made the heavens? Who made, Job, can you answer this? Basically saying, like, let's review Job. I'm in charge. I have all power. I am the creator. I am the father. I am the beginning and the end. And I am on your side. He is comforted by being told that he cannot understand the beautiful shorthand of the universe. I like that phrase. The beautiful shorthand of the universe. To me, that might indicate that we don't understand all things. Remember Nephi says that? No, I know many things, but I don't know all things. And that's okay, because I know that everything will unfold according to the purposes of God. And my choice is to get on the train or to get out of the way. But it will progress. The kingdom of God will be completed with all those who desire to be a part of it. Certainly, if we desire to be in the celestial kingdom, that is being made possible. That has been made possible through the mercy of the plan and the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Anybody who truly desires that will have it. So sometimes in this life, it's like we don't get the shorthand because we are not reminded of the whole story in every circumstance, but we can reach for it because we are given answers to the most challenging of the questions. We don't know the details of it, and that will unfold in the future so that we can see how God was getting us from dust to glory, and how if we try to stay on that covenant path diligently, not perfectly, but diligently, he is bringing us along. So here are some iconic expressions originating from Job. We've mentioned a couple of them, but worth repeating. There are many prominent metaphors, idioms, and phrases that have become deeply embedded in the English language, like by the skin of my teeth. That comes from Job 19:20, used to denote a narrow escape. And then there's a phrase, and maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. I have, but I don't hear it often. But I remember hearing this more when I was younger. Job's comforters, which is not a compliment if to be called like Job's comforters. There's a phrase describing people who try to comfort someone in distress, but end up making them feel worse. So they try to comfort, but they make you feel worse. And, we've probably all experienced that. They should write books about things not to say to people who've been through divorce, or people who've lost a parent, or people who've lost a partner, or people who've lost a child. Like, you could fill book after book with things not to say. And often they're well-intentioned, but it does come off as one of Job's comforters. Then, of course, this beautiful one that we already quoted from Job chapter 1, the Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away. And this one that I also mentioned from Job 5, man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. And sparks do fly upward. So yes, we are here to be tested. Famous declarations within the text, and again, we've talked about some of these. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil, from Job chapter 2. And then kind of a defiant trust. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. And I like that phrase, defiant trust. It's like, in a way, do your worst. Do your worst. I am not going anywhere. I'm not enjoying it, but I'm not going anywhere. And the hope of resurrection, for I know that my Redeemer lives. I liked a statement that Neil Maxwell made in a BYU devotional address in 1999 called Sharing Insights from My Life. This wasn't the big point of his speech, and he made several points, but I appreciated that he acknowledged that there are some among us, and then he uses this language, who could indeed have a conversation with Job and hold their own. In other words, many of us do go through Job-like trials. And that's good company to be kept in as long as we learn those beautiful parts, the acceptance of pain, but the unyielding trust in God and his plan. And then something more from John Tanner's article at that Sperry Symposium, Hast Thou Considered My Servant Job? No book in the Bible touches us quite like Job. That its power has been universally felt is evident by the countless references to Job from a chorus of sensitive voices over thousands of years. And he makes quite a list here, and I know it's not comprehensive, but listen to these people who have discussed Job: Augustine, Calvin, Kierkegaard, Kant, Jung, Bacon, Blake, Pascal, Montesquieu, Milton, Melville, Dostoevsky, and Goethe. These readers and many more, both great and small, have all, after their fashion, considered Job. Civilization's wrestle with Job, no less than Jacob's wrestle with the angel, has left the Judeo-Christian world forever changed. Even today, the book of Job frames the terms of discussion for certain fundamental and permanent questions with which every generation of believers must grapple. Now, here's a nice statement by Robert D. Hales. It's not quoting Job exactly, but you'll see the relevance. No, I'm sorry, he does reference Job. Even with the shining examples of Job, the prophets, and the Savior, we will still find it challenging to wait upon the Lord, especially when we cannot fully understand his plan and purposes for us. That understanding is most often given line upon line and precept upon precept. It's from his speech, Waiting Upon the Lord, in October of 2011. And here from President Daniel Wells, who was a counsel in the first presidency to Brigham Young. This is back from 1876. It's a little long, but bear with me. I really like it. Let us give heed to the requirements of heaven. That's nicely put. Let us give heed to the requirements of heaven and perform them regardless of the consequences. trusting in God who will sustain us even to the death. If we have to meet obstacles, what of it? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Let this be the word in the heart and mind of every man and woman before the Lord. Because we know he is the wise giver of all good things, the wise controller of all events, who does all things well. Let us put our trust in him and go forward in the righteousness of the God of our salvation, in the performance of the work allotted to us, his saints, upon the earth. If we do this and endure faithful to the end, great will be our reward. And great is our reward as we pass along. It brings peace of mind in the assurance that we are doing God's will and taking that course which is pleasing unto him. I think that's a beautiful summary. Let us give heed to the requirements of heaven and perform them regardless of the consequences. What was the phrase that was used in description? Defiant trust. Defiant trust. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. All said within a context that in the end, those who trust in him will rise triumphant with him in the ultimate victory of having overcome the natural man and become a child of Christ, and then again a child of God, to be co-heirs with Christ. Brothers and sisters, I'm grateful for this book in the Bible. It has meant so much to me personally and continues to do so. I hope it will mean the same to you, or something like it, in giving us validation, comfort, and a prize to reach for, that undeviating, unyielding trust. Let us choose glory, choose celestial glory, and become a Zion-ready people. As ever, my thanks to my dear husband, Chris Anderson. I'm recording this on what would have been one of our anniversaries, remains one of our anniversaries. Not the kind I look forward to anymore, but it's okay. Grateful for the gifts that my marriage brought me and brings me. My thanks to Chris and to Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.